Hello and welcome everyone. As we get started, please go ahead and share in the chat which institution you're joining us from today. I'm Terry Brown and I'm Vice President for Academic Innovation and Transformation at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. I'm looking forward to today's conversation, moving beyond the AI detector, rebuilding trust and validating learning. We know that you, our campus leaders, are working hard to respond to the arrival of AI on your campuses and its far-reaching implications for the mission of the university, teaching, learning, research, and scholarship. Today's conversation will shed light on research, tools, and practical strategies that may inform your thinking about this transformative technology. Thank you so much to our partner, Studiosity, for bringing us this timely and relevant content. Please note that the webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sharing that recording with you afterwards. We invite your questions and comments in the chat throughout the program. And now I'm pleased to introduce Goldie Blumenstick of Studiosity to kick off the conversation and introduce our panelists. So Goldie?
Great. Hi, thanks, Terry, very much. I'm Goldie Blumenstick. Some of you know, I'm seeing in the chat, I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces already in the chat, so that's great. Not faces, but names of people I've known over the years. As many of you know, I was a longtime reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education for 36 years. I'm now a senior fellow at Studiosity, among a few other jobs that I'm doing in my post-Chronicle days. A minute or two about Studiosity before we begin. Some of you may not be that familiar with the company. The goal of Studiosity is clear. It's to keep the learning real, a goal I emphasize with, I agree with a lot. Studiosity aims to fiercely protect the friction required for deep learning. Let's call it the desired difficulty, because that's really where the degree value lives. For too long, with the beginning of other ed tech tools and now, of course, the arrival of AI, the sector has relied on reactive and obsolete detection and surveillance models. And today, Studiosity is helping universities shift to an infrastructure that's built to support student learning and to validate it. To be clear, Studiosity is not anti-AI, it's pro-thinking. And Studiosity provides the multi-layered assessment infrastructure that allows students to stand up for their own learning. Frankly, that's also the theme for today's conversation. And I'm very grateful to Studiosity for giving me the opportunity to have this platform to lead this conversation. I should say, as a former reporter, I'm also very grateful when there are news pegs and things in the ether out there that kind of make these sorts of conversations relevant. And I couldn't be more grateful this time to Pope Leo, of our Pope from Chicago, who put out a very interesting encyclical the other day. It's called Magnifica Humanitas, on safeguarding the human person in the time of artificial intelligence. Why am I quoting the Pope in this conversation? Well, for one thing, the Pope, in this encyclical, the Pope talks a lot about the proper and critical use of digital tools. He warns about letting higher education devolve into where institutions become places where there's just an incessant flow of information, and that replaces the essential exercise of research, reflection, and discernment. And finally, he talked also that we shouldn't let higher education be fearful of digital tools. We should adapt them, but use them critically, in critical ways. I think there's going to be a little article that I could post in the chat. There was a really interesting essay about this that ran in IHE, Inside Higher Ed, a few weeks ago, and I encourage you all to read it. It gives a nice perspective on what the Pope's got to say. But now let's hear what our guests have to say. I'm so excited today to have Drs. Sumant Yundouri, who's Provost and Senior Vice President at Sam Houston State University, and Yolanda Watson-Spiva, who's President of Complete College America, a student success organization that helps students of all, older students, traditional students, and older students understand the better ways to get through college, and also helps institutions find ways to help these students make their way through college. I'm going to shape this conversation today around sort of 3 themes, and then a 4th theme, and then we're going to of course, have some of your questions come in. I think the first question we want to talk about really the anxiety that students are facing right now about the use of AI, and where they stand with it. Certainly, the anxiety faculty members are feeling about the the way AI is changing pedagogy and assessment. I also want to make sure particularly for those of you on this webinar who are institutional leaders and maybe not in the classroom, talk a little bit about the anxiety around academic integrity policies, because the policies, even policies that were enacted just 2 or 3 years ago, sort of seem inadequate for the time. And then ultimately, I think we want to bring this conversation around to the ways that institutions can find other tools, other services, other bits of sort of academic infrastructure to help everybody sort of tackle these problems in a most constructive way. But let's start, folks, with the anxiety around the students. I know a lot of you are seeing this yourselves, Yolanda and Samantha. I'm sure you're seeing it very directly. Students are afraid of uh, for students, actually, they don't even really know what to think about AI. We've seen in these graduations this year, students are booing it when the speakers talk about the power of AI. Students are having a different reaction. They use it, yet they have seem to have a love-hate relationship. They use it, but they also dislike it and are distrustful of it. They worry about the fairness. They worry about being falsely accused, and they worry about not learning. So I guess I'm wondering what you guys are seeing in your own institutions and Yolanda, among the many institutions that you work with. What does this anxiety look like day to day on campuses? Samantha, I'm going to have you take this first. Like, what are you seeing? What are you seeing from students, and what are you hearing?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the question. There is no doubt that there's anxiety across the students from an academic integrity perspective. It's not just about the usage. We all know some students may use in prohibitive ways, but it's not just about the usage. It's just getting blamed, the fear of getting caught, or even more importantly, to say being falsely accused. I do think that then breeds decreased motivation and engagement from among those students. And there are aspects of things that we don't even look at to figure out if that affects all students the same. For example, we all know that detection tools have false positives, sometimes might not provide all the transparency you need. And these could be based on how you interpret the syllabus and you go about and do your prompting and figure things out. And I do feel that there is a vulnerability of students being disproportionately misclassified. For example, for a non-native English speaker, how do you go about using this tool and coming up with a work product that might, unfortunately, or a neurodivergent learner? I do believe that what we're seeing is we've got all kinds of student conduct reports, certain kinds of things that we look at from an ombudsperson case load trends, the dean of students, there's climate surveys that you can take. This is a real and ongoing thing. We have to bring students into the conversations along with the faculty members to figure out how do we go about providing clearer instructions on legitimate use of these tools embedded through examples, guidance, syllabi, rubrics, and just the usage of how you want to do that. Unfortunately, it's not easy because that can mean different things for different disciplines. And then if a student is reading four different kinds of things from four different syllabi on how they have to use it, depending on if it's writing versus critical thinking or what have you, that adds another barrier towards confusing the students who are already in there. So the summary is basically that we see students being impacted widely. Recognition in some way, whether it's negative or positive from students, must be appreciated because that then allows for us to have a conversation with them. But figuring out the ways that we can support them to use is probably going to be the most impactful thing. Thank you.
I've also been hearing, from a lot of students that I've talked to, from the students I've heard speaking on podcasts and others. Students have sort of developed a little bit of their own, I guess, their own ideology about it. They maybe won't use it so much in their own major, but when it's the general ed thing, or if it's one of those electives, they sort of adopt a different philosophy. It sort of seems like the students themselves are kind of creating their own codes about when and how they use it and how much. I
Could be. I wouldn't assume that it is one way or the other. I know of students walking in and figuring out I don't need Janet at all. I've knocked it out when I was a high school student. I've taken everything there. I'm just going to come in and start my major. That's been happening even without the AI factor.
Mhm. Yolanda, what do you, how do you, I mean, I know you talk to leaders at a lot of institutions, so you know what, some way you have a kind of a perspective of many places. What are you hearing about this kind of anxiety?
Yeah, we're hearing that it's really a design issue, so that when institutions are leading with surveillance mentality rather than one of support, they actually are creating exactly the wrong conditions for learning. And so they're actually working against themselves by creating the surveillance mentality. And so students are then put in a position where they're utilizing a tool that is ubiquitous in every workplace that they will eventually enter, but can be treated as evidence of wrongdoing in their place of academic endeavors. And so there's a little bit of a consternation and a disconnect between how they're being trained or they're being acculturated in the academic environment versus how AI is going to be used in the workplace. And so it creates a chilling effect, as you sort of alluded to, that is real, and it's showing up in how students are engaging with the coursework, how they ask for help, and whether they feel like they belong. So it's actually, again, creating the opposite effect of what we want in terms of student engagement. Because when students are afraid that the tools their institutions have permitted on a nominal basis have permitted them to use, when their institution then tells them that the policy framework hasn't caught up with the reality of student use, then there's really a disconnect. And so we have to make sure that structurally and from a policy wise perspective, that we are engaged with students from a design perspective that is not in a surveillance stance, but is more of a support stance. Because the institutions that are getting this right, they've actually moved away from ad hoc course by course AI policies toward really a more coherent institution-wide governance framework, and those are the ones that actually define what responsible AI use looks like from the beginning. They establish consistent expectations across their departments, and then they build the ethical literacy of AI into the curriculum so that students know where the lines of demarcation for acceptable and ethical use and unacceptable and unethical use, and they understand where those lines are and why. So having a
But
more systemic approach is the answer.
I want to dig into a little bit more of that as we gonna get into this conversation. But let's just keep the focus on students for one more second here, because now I'm wondering, like, obviously talk about this as a systemic problem and a sort of a systems approach. Like how, obviously it means something different for how you think about your academic advising and your sort of even your social, the sort of the curricular advising, the non-academic advising. How are institutions, Sumant, how is your institution, has it changed how it how it trains its advisors? And just more broadly, how do you sort of inculcate this into the culture of advising in a different way? Sumant, take it first, and then I'll go back to Yolanda.
Sure. I do think that advisors have to be leveraged in ways that is more meaningful. The caseload on advisors itself is just so much that the time that they can actually provide in most institutions for the students to talk about and how to navigate this is difficult. I still feel the it's not the advising side of things that needs to be worked upon. There are aspects that you can lead through. Different, okay. If it's graduate, you have faculty themselves advising the students, right? In some institutions, you have undergrad students also being advised by faculty. So who are those people who are advising? To me, it's the faculty who would be more important in the design and use and adoption of any of these, not, I wouldn't say policies, any of these metrics or rubrics that they're on bringing, because I do agree that it has to be about embracing AI. If you start thinking about AI enriched learning, that might be the case, because I don't think as higher ed at this point has actually defined what AI literacy means, because that is extremely different for each discipline.
And then I guess in some cases, there's also a lot of places, there's a lot of peer advising. So to me, that introduces another wrinkle in the mix, because you have, maybe you even have an infrastructure for talking to your professional advisors and your academic advisor staff. But when you bring in the peer advisors into the mix, and peer advisors, students might have different perspectives on these things than their faculty members. Yolanda, have you encountered any issues, particularly maybe even with peer advising, but just advising in general?
Well, the institutions that I think are kind of getting it right are helping the advisors understand how they can have more depth because of the very outsized student to advisor ratios that we're seeing. And so they're helping utilizing AI to help them routinize certain aspects of the advising strategy. So if they are taking notes from their advising sessions, and then they want to figure out if there are trends across all of the different students, AI can help to, amalgamate the data and then provide some summaries of some of the themes that are being seen across the data and help them then potentially go back to the academic affairs unit and think about ways that they can either create solutions to help students to traverse different barriers. So those are some of the ways that you can utilize AI as an agent to help you accomplish some goal that would take you more time to do, or to mine through lots of data around students. And so even if you're talking about student grades, not on a identified basis, but on an unidentified basis, how do we look at across the different transcripts and see where the DFW rates are or things of that nature that can help us develop a profile of where students are having issues. So those are some of the places where I'm seeing institutions, I think, getting it right in terms of how to deploy AI in advising.
Which it also sets a model too, because it's saying no one's saying don't use it, and no
Right.
one's saying it's not helpful, but we're people are saying let's use it, use it for an educational purpose, not for a cheating purpose, in effect. Um, you know,
On that, sorry,
yeah,
I just
no, go
wanted to
ahead.
say on the advising part, it's interesting. The concept is about how do you improve efficiency of how they can work. That absolutely I agree with. But the problem then becomes AI integration, about thoroughly trusting whatever the tools, because these tools are changing from morning to afternoon to evening, and then the contractual process of taking something in for 5 years versus 3 years or 2 years, the testing out how that integration would happen, it becomes key. But from an administrative standpoint, maybe I cannot hire another 10 advisors, but I can give them the tools to use it. There are, maybe not here at SAM, but in some institutions, there's also always a fear of using these tools because they're being seen as or perceived as replacing the advisor themselves.
Yeah,
I just wanted
and
to add one more thing, Goldie, to that, to his point, just making sure that we keep a human in the loop, right? We cannot have these tools be deployed and we just sort of let it go on its own.
right. So I know we've actually we've talked a little bit about this notion of the way the notion of academic integrity policies change. And I want to talk a little bit about that more in a minute. But this notion of having authentic learning and going from what you want to talk from a surveillance approach to and to a more of a validation approach. I mean, I know that's a big theme for the sponsor of this webinar. I know it's a big theme in higher ed in general, that maybe this notion of, trying to play catch up and play whack-a-mole on AI is not going to really work anymore. But what does it look like to have a more of a validation philosophy, a validation approach in these policies, and how would that help? Could that help students more? Yolanda, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, to be honest, it looks different at every institution, but I'll give you examples from two institutions two systems. One is the University of Louisiana system, and what they did was build what we like to call a tool agnostic micro credential that focuses on what students can demonstrate in terms of their understanding of AI ethics, data privacy, and the implications of the technology, not just their ability to use a specific tool. So it's really more about making sure they understand the ramifications and the parameters of the tools. At UMass Lowell, faculty were given mini grants specifically to help them redesign how they assess learning when AI was a part of the process. And so they moved toward assignments where students had to demonstrate their thinking, their judgment, and the iterations that they used when they employed AI. So the through line is that the authentic validation actually asks students to demonstrate something that AI can't do for them, which is demonstrate their own reasoning, their own ethical framework, their own application of knowledge to real problems. And that's what the credentials should signal anyway. AI should just make it more urgent for them to design for that particular piece explicitly. So that's what we're kind of seeing in terms of some of the best practices in the field.
Well, that's great. I'm really glad that you mentioned the faculty, because it's kind of where I want to go next with this conversation. Before I do that, just I want to remind people in the audience, if you want to pose a question, please use the Q&A which I think you might have to hit the more button to get to it. Put your questions in the Q&A, and we can get to those in a few minutes. Let's talk about the whole faculty thing. Obviously, mini grants, that's something that really makes it easier to sort of institute cultural change in an institution, because people don't want to feel faculty already feel very beleaguered by a lot of the demands that are being put on them, particularly when there's ed tech demands that are being put on them. And obviously having some leeway and some resources to develop changes makes a very big difference. But this arrival of AI, more so than any tool I can remember covering higher education in for almost 4 decades, seems to have really changed the nature of pedagogy and changes the nature of assessment. Certainly as quickly, required a change that's quicker than anything I've ever seen before. I guess I'm wondering, as institutional leaders, I'm going to start with you and Sumant on this, and then how do you think about this? While, you have to really encourage your faculty to change a lot of things about how they work. And how do you do this while also respecting academic freedom, respecting their expertise in their fields? Like, I mean, a grant is one approach, I guess, but not everybody has grant resources at their disposal. So how else can you kind of implement some of this culture change that's necessary right now for faculty members?
Appreciate that. Faculty are being asked to redesign courses, learn new tools, and also sort of like feel what this new legal exposure might look like, and sometimes without additional time or compensation. Um, are they educators versus are they being obligated to work as policy enforcers? To me, I think the conversation should start with the community. Specifically, at Sam Houston State University, we have a teaching and a learning center. There's all kinds of faculty development initiatives and programming that helps. Some of it is incentive opportunities like grants, but others are also longer piloted workshops because you can only get so much in a webinar such as this. You got to be really engaged in and also improving self-efficacy of faculty. So if you think through this, a teaching and learning center in today's day and age is probably the most underutilized strategic asset any institution has. Their value is more like a connective tissue between policy, pedagogy, and practice. You can bring students, and students have to be part of this conversation. Stanford's Academic Integrity Group is doing the same as they're designing policies related to academic integrity. The students and faculty are part of this conversation because if we look at academic integrity, that's always been more of a teaching and learning issue, which can actually be solved, at least in partial ways, if we have good pedagogy and clear communication between instructors and students. That again then brings about the framing of how do you use a CTL, a Center for Teaching and Learning Center, that presents solutions, facilitates conversations, and moves us in such a way that when you're putting a policy in place, you also want to make sure, or a practice in place, you're making sure that there are no gaps between these two, practice and policy.
What doesn't work? I mean, you sort of hinted at that a little bit, but have you seen examples that you're relatively new at Sam Houston, you were at University in Georgia before that. Like, have you seen nothing that you've done, of course, but have you seen some things that just don't play well, don't encourage, don't sort of work in the environment and discourage people?
Well, I think it was Metropolitan Technical University. I can't remember, but it starts with that. What they introduced was, for example, um, where do you have the biggest issues with retention in the first year? This was more on the student success aspects, and they looked at math and English of the two courses as the primary places where things would happen. So they were able to get faculty members to participate in a pilot from math and English departments to say, here's an AI-based course assistant that can help you deliver your course, whether it's like new tests that you want to put together, things that you want to do, and what have you. Their results have been pretty interesting because they've seen legitimate, clear improvement in those metrics that they're looking at. Such an issue would be something that the TLC can formulate and present it to faculty and seek their, early adopters. Maybe they can be recognized to test these things out. If that came about from a provost office saying all faculty should now start using this as an assistant. Now, there's always aspects where you can present certain tools and say it's a volunteer basis. But even feeling comfortable about using a tool is it takes time. And that's where a TLC can work with a faculty member, get them familiarized with this is what the value is. Doesn't
Uh-huh.
mean they have to use every feature that the tool produces or provides. They can accustom because the academic freedom should be protected from all perspectives and pedagogy of how that discipline would want to adopt and teach is absolutely vital.
So it does sound like number one, more like a bottom-up approach in a way works,
Yes,
but also
yes,
with some real evidence, it sounds like. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yolanda, what are you seeing right now? I mean, this is in effect a change management issue, kind of a cultural issue, but but it has to happen. It can't, and the universities don't really have the luxury of time on this. Feels like if they wait 5 years for let's be right, let's be fair a little bit. Sometimes academic policies can take a while, but the integrity of the degree is at stake here. So how have you seen this working well with faculty members in institutions getting this stuff, new approaches adopted?
Yeah, the institutions that are doing this well, first of all, they start by asking a different question. Instead of asking, how do we prevent misuse, they're actually asking, what do we want students to actually know and be able to do? And so that reframe, keep going back to that because this is about your perspective, which leads to the change in policy and change in perspective, right? So, change in practice. So, that reframe really changes everything about how the policy gets written. I talked a little bit earlier about the University of Louisiana system. They've also embedded an ethics first principle at the very beginning of their AI literacy curriculum. And they did that not as a warning, but as a foundation. And so before a student ever picks up a tool, they've already been grappling with questions about bias, about data privacy, labor displacement, and truth, right? And so that becomes a policy orientation, not just from the top down, from administrators and faculty, but also from the student up. And it also is a curriculum choice. And so for the institutions that are rewriting their policies to infuse AI right now, the most important thing that I've seen is the ones that are doing a good job on this are first of all involving faculty in the process rather than handing down directives. And they're building in explicit review cycles because the landscape, as you said, is moving so fast that for any policy written today to still be fully adequate in 2 years, we know that's not going to be the case. So you have to make sure the policies of today are oriented around learning outcomes rather than around what students are prohibited from doing. And then that will lay the groundwork for being able to have change management and adoption by faculty and others.
Yeah, it really does strike me. This is what we're talking about. It's a culture change.
Yeah.
And you have to sort of talk a lot about what I think as I was getting ready for this conversation, I read this really terrific essay about like what the value of AI is, and it talked a little bit about um, education is about the struggle to learn. And I guess we have to sort of reframe this conversation that students understand that's part of education is struggling. That doesn't mean getting it right all the time.
Mhm.
You're winning, but students need to understand that, and the faculty members need to sort of imbue that in their teaching as well. I, I wonder when we've talked a little bit about academic integrity policies, and I want to talk about that just for a minute here because I feel like there's a lot of anxiety about these academic integrity policies right now, especially the concerns about like the false positives,
Mhm.
the false accusations. And I know there are some cases where students are schools are actually prohibiting, there are a lot of off-the-shelf detection policies. And I know I've seen some cases, at least one in, I think, University of Texas, Samantha, you might know about this, recently prohibited faculty members from using their own choices of detection policies because they're like literally liability issues. Suddenly you could get schools can be sued for falsely accusing people. How can, Yolanda, you talked earlier about having kind of a system-wide, sort of a cohesive policy about these academic integrity policies, but how can places really know that they're doing the right thing by their students at this point?
Yeah, and I think to your point, Goldie, it's making a lot of the faculty anxious because they don't want to be the person that triggered a lawsuit because they falsely accused someone. So when the faculty, we found when the faculty are anxious about AI, it's typically because the institution has not given them a clear framework to work within. So they're making individual judgment calls, as you said, with their own AI detectors and AI tools, and they're doing this in a policy vacuum. And that can be exhausting because they're trying to chase the updates that they're reading reading about in the Chronicle or in other publications and trying to figure out where this is all going. But when faculty have clear institutional guidance on what AI use looks like in their discipline, in their peer community to learn alongside, and they have resources that allow them to experiment, as you've mentioned in terms of the Centers for Teaching and Learning, that anxiety then begins to dissipate. And so it signals that the institution has made a decision that we're going to engage with AI thoughtfully, and we're going to support you in doing that when that structure is there. So the institutions that we've seen that are succeeding are building shared norms through faculty-led processes. They're creating review structures, as I've mentioned before, so that the policy evolves as the technology does as well. And it makes ethics and equity, and I continue to go back to that, it makes ethics and equity central to how AI gets used rather than treating those as afterthoughts. And so good governance, I've found, doesn't constrain faculty. It actually liberates them to innovate within the framework that they trust, but then holds them as partners in the process of how AI gets adopted and reviewed over time.
Samarth, do you have a policy at your institution right now?
We do, but when you look through this, what is it that we are trying to do? We've always been evaluating or grading the final work product, right? That's what we want to grade. But I think the question is not about did AI write this, did AI assist with? It's about trying to figure out the evidence of learning. Did the student demonstrate the learning in this particular assignment, whatever the outcome leads up to? So it's not the role of detecting, it's probably what is it that you're trying to detect is what is changing. The aspect of when we think through, we're not wanting to be like, don't use AI, but how do you use AI? Some of the framework about figuring out what is appropriate or not with the tool is important, but that changes very quickly because there's image tools and there's video tools, there's finance tools. There's so many of these AI-based tools with several aspects. The way we went about it is, can we figure out a way to start leaning into whether they are called scaffolding assignments? Like, can we grade the learning steps as you set a baseline and you can grade the learning steps as you're working towards the final products? Let's just say in my discipline, when you write code, you have something called a version control software. Any change you make, anything, and it's going on over a period of time that actually shows you to measure the evolution of understanding of every student. The core principle here is plagiarism could be defined at one point as, did I basically take someone else's work? However, the way Sam is looking at it is this your work? And have you demonstrated the learning around this specific piece of assignment or quiz or whatever that you're submitting?
So I really like the focus of this, basically talking about a new culture. We need to, we have to sort of shift the notion of what education is and and it is really a culture problem, not so much a detection problem. So as we sort of wrap up and we move to some Q&A questions in a minute here, I'm wondering what are the other cultural factors that we might want to be considering here? I'm wondering, what other resources out there? What are there tools out there? What sort of a general sort of infrastructure is out there that can help institutions address these problems? One thing I've been wondering about particularly is like the library. I have a few other questions about a few other places. I'm wondering about orientation. Is there a way to think about orientation, admissions, maybe even the career center? Any thoughts on the kinds, in addition to obviously some protection, some legitimate like sort of tools, but what are other ways to kind of alter the culture around what we think about as education? Go ahead, Yolanda, why don't you take this one?
Sure. So what we're seeing is one, that those departments that are utilizing AI are actually having shared conversations about the deployment within their various departments, and then, of course, within academic disciplines as well. So being able to share the tools they're using and how they're using it is an important first step, because what we're seeing from leading institution is that they're investing in three areas. First is the AI literacy infrastructure, as I've mentioned before, and that's where they're creating a campus-wide shared language and a baseline competency rather than leaving individual faculty to figure it out alone. So when they're sharing what they're utilizing, where they're going with it, it actually helps to create a community. And then there's some people who literally have asked the question, who is Claude, for example, right? So they have no idea that it's a tool. So
Hey,
you
I barely know Claude,
so they go from, being completely, agnostic that there is this thing called AI out there to those who are really, mavericks in terms of utilization. The second tier is like those who have the faculty innovation within their embedded in their programs. So they're giving faculty the resources and structure to support in order to redesign assessments from the ground up and do that discipline by discipline. So where we're seeing institutions really fare well is when they do give faculty the runway to be innovative and then to share those innovations across the institution. And then the third area where we're really seeing strong investment is within data systems that will tell you whether your approach is working. And so this will help them identify where AI is actually driving learning outcomes versus where it's creating confusion. And so a lot of times when you have a lot of different AI tools running amok across the curriculum or across your systems, your operating systems, there's more confusion than there is facilitated structure. And so this sort of data informed approach is what lets institutions, I think, make smart investment decisions rather than chasing the next tool, which we can do that all day long if we continue to just look at the tools du jour. So the investment that actually moves the needle is in building institutional capacity for AI literacy at scale. And I think that's where if the systems or infrastructures are built for that, the tools will resolve themselves.
And again, that seems like an evidence question as well. You're coming back to like also invest where the evidence shows it makes sense.
Yeah.
So Mont, what do you think about my idea about orientation and even like I'm wondering even if the admissions message is this is how AI matters at our school. Here's where we recognize AI as a factor. Does this am I just like making this stuff up or does that make some sense?
I I guess providing resources during an orientation is useful, but imagine a student coming in during orientation doing 500 things from immunization to residence life and
Okay.
so many aspects there. I fear it might get lost. Now, where I think there is value, for example, at Sam Houston, we have a University 1101 seminar course that is required by every student in their first semester. There's a follow-up course in the second semester, which is a little bit more on the career side of things. Every student is taking that course. So if we were to ensure, it doesn't matter which course you're in, which discipline it is, what your major is, that's the place where you can actually make good impact in teaching students the value of use and actually ask the faculty members when they have questions about this is how I intend to do my assignment or work with, even with all the things, there's always certain room for ambiguity. I also have to say that there are a lot of tools that are available, but there are certain kinds of categories that can easily be looked at, like process documentation tools. Or, when I was an undergraduate student, whenever I did a lab, irrespective of what your output was for the lab, there would be a faculty member who would talk to each student to have a short oral defense. It's not necessarily a dissertation defense, but 10 minutes. What you do, how did you do, where did you get this from, that sort of thing.
Show your
So
work. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. So those kind of things, that was much more difficult than the actual lab because are they making connections with the real world of why? Or you take this thing and if I say, I will change this one variable on the 17th line of the code that you wrote, what is it going to happen? And so it just made it so much more engaging that you can understand why you're doing what you're doing. So there are practices, there's rubrics, there are these kind of tools that you can use. But overall, I do think that embedding it in the places where you have the maximum touch with these students and as early as you can do it.
Right.
And you introduce it, you repeat it, you remind it.
That's why I was trying to understand that a little bit. I'm thinking this does require a new culture, a new ethos, a new understanding, this new approach. And so just trying to figure out where, at what point does it get adopted and introduced along the way? I want to jump quickly to questions now. We're kind of running down towards the end of our time here. And Sharon asks, how do you have the discussion with faculty about incorporating AI when they have their own environmental concerns about AI data centers? She says, I have some faculty centers that believe AI is ethically wrong for these reasons and do not want to engage with it. I have a thought, but I'm guessing you guys might have some too.
I was just going to add that I think you have the conversation very candidly and openly and hear their concerns, and also potentially try to engage with the companies who are placing data centers in that particular community where the institution is housed. In order to have maybe some thoughtful, and especially if the institution has research or data that they can share with the companies that are implementing the data centers, helping to inform them as well about some of the harm that may be being caused. But I think having an open dialogue and not acting tone deaf about some of the social ills of associated with AI is important, and just being straightforward and forthright.
Simon?
I I would add that AI is not a passing trend. I understand a lot of folks have given weight towards AI in the past 5, 6 years, but it's existed since 1950s in our discipline. People have looked at it. But I can definitely say that it is confirmed and that there will be and there is happening a seismic shift in how we learn, educate, and operate. And just look at the 39 months or odd, whatever has happened in the chat GPT's public releases. Since then until now, probably represents the most compressed period of higher ed coming together to talk about policy revision. If that's not an indicator that's telling you that you need to have a real conversation and you're doing it in the interest of the students, they have to be AI enabled workforce. You're preparing a student for a job that did not exist a year ago. Where do you start? How do you begin? And employers are demanding that they ought to be ready. So you have all these other things to frame that conversation about the need to have that. These are the reasons why we are working towards it. At the end of the day, we're serving students for them to be successful. And if we don't get them to a point that they come to us with a life problem to solve, which is to find a job or get into grad school. And if we can't let, it's not about 4 year, 6 year graduation rates alone. It's about the student being successful after. And that's the demand that our society is actually asking of us. And obviously, universities are always blamed by corporate world that you're too slow to change, have to meet the expectations of what we have here. So I would add just presenting the given situation to a reality situation.
Yeah, and I guess my other thought is faculty may have these ethical concerns, and many students also have them, but some students don't. And as you said, it's still there. Another question from Catherine kind of talks a lot about the ways that using AI can be a useful tool in the educational process. But I guess the gist of this question at the bottom is how can universities think about using these AI tools to help sort of improve project-based learning and other kinds of critical thinking, and also not just at the higher ed level, but kind of at the, this question talks a little bit about the P through 20 level. Basically, how do we make sure that even some of the factors that matter in higher education get imbued to students before they get to higher ed? Get this notion of the friction of learning, the ethos. Is there a role for universities in this? I mean, I know we're putting a lot on colleges these days, but is there a role for universities to kind of make sure that, students come before they even get to higher ed, that their K-12 experiences are good?
Well, yeah, and then colleges and universities host summer camps and all sorts of experiences on their campuses all the time. And so I think that's a great opportunity to engage with students in that way, in their recruiting and marketing tools, talking about the ways in which the future that they see for those students when they become learners on their campus. So I think that also, having the advisors and folks on the campus partner with the school counselors at the middle school and secondary level, and then talking about what the expectations are and the learning outcomes. Again, going back to creating the outcomes that they would like to see and helping learners understand how the experiences they have, whether it's with AI or with the curriculum writ large, will help prepare them. That's going to be an important way to do that.
Yeah. Samantha, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, there are these phrases about explainable AI, meaning how does AI even work? Can you explain it? If you can't explain it, that's trust, right? So trustworthy AI and explainable AI come in the framework in the sense that we always talk about using AI for different kinds of things. Have people talked about or looked into what about the security of these own tools? All of these things is to say that awareness more than education in this space should start as early as possible. I would go as early as middle school because kids are they are using all these kind of things in their
Yeah.
schools. Let's not be mistaken at all. They are being exposed to this. So the earlier the learning starts, I go back to this, the earlier that you expose them to how to ethically, responsibly use these, it's always going to be useful. Now, how can we help with them? Almost every institution I've worked at has a college of education with strong connection to schools. And there could be pathways that we can build and understand, and not just with schools, also community colleges. We're making sure the transfer students also getting the same sort of information.
Great. That's a great way to wrap this up. Awesome. Sumanth and Yolanda, thank you so much for this conversation. I learned a lot along the way, and I hope folks in our audience did as well, and I appreciate your time. Back
Thank
to
you.
Terry. We'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Goldie, Sumanth, and Yolanda, for this enlightening conversation. I came away with so many thoughts about this. Clearly, there's more anxiety with the arrival of this technology than the arrival of the internet on campus in the 1990s. Your conversation raised so many key questions about what's acceptable use now of this ubiquitous tool. How do institutions ensure that the approach to AI doesn't create a surveillance state, which is antithetical to the values of belonging? Antithetical, I should say. How can institutions use AI for more routine tasks while allowing human advisors to engage more meaningfully with students? So many great questions. How can faculty be part of the surveillance ethos, or how can they be facilitators of authentic, liberating learning? So many questions raised here and thoughtful with your thoughtful conversation. Thank you again. And thank you to Studiosity for your support of this webinar. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I hope that we'll see many of you at our summer meeting in New Orleans, July 13th through the 16th. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.